My parents left me out of the will. They didn't expect my revenge. The room smelled like old wood and cheap coffee. The kind of smell that sticks to everything in a small-town lawyer's office. It was a Tuesday in late October, 2019. Outside, the fields were brown and quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. Daniel Mercer sat in a stiff wooden chair, third from the left, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn to his father's funeral 3 days before. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten much. And he was about to hear something that would either confirm his worst fear or finally lay it to rest. The lawyer, a tired man named Grover Whitfield, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, 4 minutes, to undo 32 years. His older brother Marcus got the house. His younger sister Patrice got the savings account, the land on Clement Road, and the grain equipment. His mother's jewelry went to Patrice's daughter, and Daniel got a single paragraph explaining, in legal language, in front of everyone, that his share had been intentionally and deliberately excluded. No explanation. No letter. No final word from the man who raised him, just excluded. Marcus looked at the table. Patrice said nothing. And Daniel sat very still, the way a man sits when he's deciding whether to feel something or bury it entirely. He chose to bury it. But what nobody in that room understood, what no one who knew Daniel Mercer could have possibly predicted, was what he was going to build on top of that burial ground. To understand what happened after that Tuesday, you have to understand where Daniel Mercer came from. And to understand that, you have to go back, way back, to a place called Harlan County in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, where the hills roll into each other like the land itself is tired, and where the Mercer family had farmed tobacco for 3 generations before the market turned on them. The Mercer farm sat on 41 acres off Route 119, past the old grain depot that closed in 2003, past the church, with a missing letter on its sign that nobody ever fixed. It was a working farm in the way that phrase carries weight in that part of the country, not picturesque, not romantic, just relentless. Up before 5, down after dark. Always something broken, always something needing attention. Daniel was born in 1987, the middle child, between Marcus, who is 3 years older, and Patrice, who came 2 years after. From the beginning, the lines in the family were drawn in ways that nobody talked about directly, but everybody understood. Marcus was his father's son. Same jaw, same walk, same easy confidence with a truck engine or a piece of machinery. He could fix a tractor at 16, and his father looked at him the way fathers look at sons they recognize as extensions of themselves. Patrice was different. Sharp-minded and quick. She was the one who made her mother proud, who got the good grades, who sat at the kitchen table and did homework while the boys worked outside. She was going to go to college. Everyone said so. And eventually she did, the University of Kentucky, 2 hours north, studying business administration. When she came back 4 years later, she brought a husband and a new way of speaking that put a little distance between her and the farm. And Daniel was the quiet one. Not quiet like sad. Quiet like watching. He was the child who noticed things, who saw how the water ran across the south field in heavy rain, who noticed the way his father planted the same corner wrong, year after year, and flooded it every spring. He mentioned it once when he was 13, and his father told him to mind what he was asked and nothing more. That was the year Daniel started keeping a notebook. He wrote things down. Small things. The kind of things that wouldn't matter to anyone else. Which rows performed better. Which fertilizer combinations his father used, and which ones quietly failed. How much rain the middle field needed before it went from productive to saturated. He didn't tell anyone about the notebook. He just kept filling it. By the time Daniel was 18, he had 4 of them. And the farm was still struggling. But that's when things started to take a different shape, because Daniel Mercer wasn't just watching the farm. He was watching everything. The Mercer family wasn't isolated. Harlan County was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, and half of them felt qualified to comment on it. The farms in that area were mostly legacy operations, families who'd held land for decades and ran it the way it had always been run, resisting change the way stone resists rain. Results didn't matter as much as tradition, and in that world, Daniel was considered, not cruelly but honestly, a little unusual. He asked too many questions. He read too much. By the time he was 20, he'd been taking community college classes at night, not agricultural science, which might have been respected, but economics and soil chemistry and logistics. Things people in Harlan County didn't quite see the point of. His father, Robert Mercer, was a man of few words and strong opinions. He wasn't mean exactly, but he was certain. Certain that farming was about instinct and experience, and the knowledge passed down through hands, not books. When Daniel mentioned something he'd read about crop rotation optimization, his father had looked at him with the particular patience of a man who had already decided not to listen and said, "Books don't know what our land knows." That became something of a family saying. Patrice repeated it sometimes with a half smile, the way younger siblings repeat things they're not sure they believe, but enjoy the effect of. Marcus didn't say much either way. Marcus was loyal to their father in the quiet, uncomplicated way that required nothing complicated in return. The wider community had its own version of this assessment. At the feed store in town, where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings the way people gather anywhere they feel seen, Daniel was known as the Mercer kid with the ideas. It wasn't a compliment. Ideas, in that context, meant someone who hadn't learned yet that the way things were done was the way they worked. Old Pete Callahan, who ran 400 acres and had for 30 years, once said in front of a small group that included Daniel's father and, unfortunately, Daniel himself, "Robert, you're going to have a problem with that one. He thinks too much and works too little." His father didn't disagree. That moment, standing in the feed store at 22 years old, watching his father not disagree, settled something in Daniel. Not bitterness, exactly. More like clarity. He understood his position in the family structure. He understood what was expected and what was valued. And he understood, in the particular way that quiet people understand things, that the path forward was not going to be handed to him. What nobody in that feed store, including his father, could have known was that Daniel had already started building the path himself. You'd walk past Daniel Mercer without noticing him. That was genuinely one of his advantages. Medium height, lean, the kind of face that looks young longer than it should. He drove a 2004 Chevy pickup with a cracked side mirror he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. He kept his notebook in the glove compartment and a thermos of black coffee in the cup holder. He wasn't dramatic about anything. He didn't announce himself. When people described Daniel in those early years, the words were always moderate. Hardworking enough. Smart, I guess. Strange sometimes. Nobody said he was driven. Nobody said he was brilliant. He was the kind of person the world treats as background, which meant the world never quite got around to watching him. He was working by that point, not on the family farm, where his contributions had never really been formalized or compensated, but at a regional agricultural supply company in Harlan called Baseline AG, where he'd gotten a job managing inventory and deliveries. It paid $31,000 a year, and it was, from the outside, deeply unremarkable. A young man with no degree, running inventory for a farm supply store, living in a rented room in a house on Ford Street with 2 other guys who worked night shifts at a processing plant. But here's what nobody knew about that job. Daniel wasn't just managing inventory.
He was learning the supply chain.
He was watching which products farms in a 2-county radius actually used versus what they ordered. He was watching prices shift by season, by weather pattern, by the news cycle. He was building a mental model of agricultural economics that no classroom had ever organized for him, but that real-world proximity was assembling piece by piece. He kept the notebooks going. For years of them now 5, then 6. Different handwriting than when he started, more compressed, more efficient, like his mind had gotten faster and needed to keep up. And beneath all of it, very quietly, he was saving money, not a lot of money. But with the discipline of someone who has decided that the future matters more than the present, Daniel Mercer was setting aside a portion of every paycheck, 30% when he could manage it, 20% when he couldn't, into a savings account he hadn't told anyone about. By 2015, he had just under $18,000, which is when something happened that nobody expected, least of all Daniel himself. The thing about Daniel's notebooks was that they weren't organized the way you'd expect. They weren't labeled with dates or categories. They were organized by questions. Each section started with a question written in capital letters at the top of the page. Why does the South field drain slower than the North? Or, what is the actual cost of tobacco per acre versus the payout? Or why did Henderson's crop outperform everyone in 2008? He'd been asking questions since he was a teenager, writing them down, and then spending months, sometimes years, gathering enough information to attempt an answer. It was a slow, obsessive process that looked, from the outside, like someone with too much time on their hands. But it was actually something closer to independent research. In 2013, Daniel had started adding a new kind of question to his notebooks. Not about crops or soil, about land itself, about property values in rural Kentucky, about why certain parcels were being quietly acquired by outside investors while long-time farming families didn't notice, about what happened to land values within 15 miles of a highway expansion. He'd been reading about this for 2 years before he acted on it. Reading county records, which were public. Reading land transaction reports, which were published quarterly. Reading infrastructure proposals, which were available to anyone willing to spend 3 hours in the county clerk's office, sorting through filing cabinets. And in early 2015, Daniel found something: a proposed highway extension, State Route 63, had been submitted for environmental review. If approved, the new bypass would cut through a corridor of rural land about 12 miles east of Harlan. The proposal had been filed 18 months earlier and gone almost entirely unnoticed by anyone outside a small circle of county commissioners and the relevant engineering firm. Daniel had found it by accident, looking for something else entirely. He read the full proposal in 2 sittings. He mapped the corridor by hand on a piece of graph paper. He identified 6 parcels of land that sat within 1 mile of the projected intersection zone, the area that would see the highest spike in commercial value if the road was approved. None of those parcels were for sale, but 2 of them had back taxes owed, and one of them, 17 acres off Cutter Lane, belonged to a retired couple named Doyle and Frances Beaumont, both in their late 70s, who had moved to Florida 3 years earlier and hadn't touched the land since. Daniel spent 3 weeks confirming what the records showed. He called the county tax assessor's office twice, pretending to be doing a routine inquiry. He drove out to Cutter Lane on a Sunday morning and walked the perimeter of the Beaumont property in rubber boots, taking notes. The land was overgrown, partially wooded, not conventionally farmable without significant work. At current market rates for rural, unimproved land in that corridor, it was worth perhaps $40,000 to $45,000. But if Route 63 was approved and built, which Daniel estimated would happen within 4 to 6 years based on the infrastructure timeline he'd read, that land would be worth 10 times that. Minimum. Possibly more, if commercial development followed the intersection. He had $18,000 saved. The Beaumont back taxes were $11,200. Enough, under Kentucky law, to initiate a purchase inquiry through the county tax lien process. He didn't sleep much for a week. He rechecked everything 4 times. He ran the numbers on pieces of paper, then ran them again. He thought about what it meant to be wrong about losing $11,000, which was more than 30% of his savings and represented nearly 4 years of discipline. And then he thought about what it meant to be right. He filed the tax lien inquiry on a Wednesday morning in March 2015. It took 14 months to complete the process. But on May 9, 2016, Daniel Mercer became the legal owner of 17 acres off Cutter Lane, Harlan County, Kentucky, at a total acquisition cost, including taxes owed, filing fees, and legal processing, of $13,400. He told no one. For the next 2 years, Daniel's life looked exactly the same from the outside. He still worked at Baseline AG. He still drove the cracked mirror Chevy. He still lived on Ford Street. He attended his parents' house for Sunday dinners when invited, which was sometimes, and sat through the same conversations about Marcus's work on the farm and Patrice's husband's job in Lexington. But things at home were getting complicated. His father, Robert Mercer, had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease in the spring of 2016. The diagnosis changed the household in the way serious illness always does. Suddenly, decisions that had been deferred became urgent. What happened to the farm? What happened to the house? Marcus had been unofficially running operations for 2 years already, but now the question of succession had weight to it. Daniel watched all of this carefully. He didn't push himself into the conversation about the farm's future. He had learned by then that pushing produced no results in this particular family. What he noticed instead was something more troubling. The farm itself, The 41 acres on Route 119 that had been in the Mercer family since 1961 was financially compromised in ways that none of his siblings seemed to fully understand. His father had taken 2 loans against the property in the last decade. One in 2009 during the financial crisis to cover operating losses. One in 2012 when a hailstorm destroyed nearly half the crop and the insurance settlement came in 30% lower than expected. The loans weren't catastrophic individually, but together, against a farm that had been marginally profitable at best for years, they represented a quiet pressure that was building. Daniel knew the numbers because he'd been watching them. Not snooping. The Mercer family finances were not a secret kept with any particular care. His parents talked about money openly, in that rural way where financial stress is a shared burden rather than a private shame. He knew what the farm earned per year. He knew what the loan payments were. He knew the equipment was aging. What he also knew, and what he suspected Marcus and Patrice did not fully appreciate, was how close the margins were. One bad season. One equipment failure at the wrong moment. One shift in commodity prices that lasted more than 18 months, and 2018, all 3 happened at once. A dry summer followed by a wet September destroyed the yield. The aging combine broke down in August, requiring a repair that cost $9,000 that the farm didn't have liquid. And tobacco prices, already under long-term pressure, dropped another 8% that year in the regional markets to be why October 2018, the Mercer farm was behind on one of its loans. Not in default, not yet, but behind. Robert Mercer was deteriorating faster than expected. Marcus was managing the farm but not the finances, which had always been Robert's domain, and which were now quietly accumulating pressure like water behind a dam. That autumn, Daniel sat down with his father, one of the few private conversations they'd had in years, and offered to help. Not to take over. Not to insert himself. Just to help stabilize the numbers while his father was unwell. His father thanked him and declined. A month later, Daniel learned from his mother that his father had updated the will. He didn't ask about it. His mother mentioned it the way people mention something they think the other person already knows, casually, while washing dishes after a Sunday dinner. "Your father made some changes with Grover last week," she said. "Just making sure everything is organized." Daniel dried a plate and said, "That makes sense." He drove home in the dark and sat in the parking lot of his apartment for 20 minutes before going inside. Here is the thing about being excluded from a will. It's not just about money. That's what people assume from the outside, that it's a financial wound, a practical loss. And yes, the financial dimension is real. But the deeper wound, the one that doesn't have an obvious name, is what exclusion communicates about how someone saw you. What it says about your value in the story of the family. Daniel Mercer had been told something on that Tuesday in October 2019 in Grover Whitfield's office. He'd been told, in the formal language of legal documentation, that he didn't belong to the story the same way the others did. He sat with that for a while. A few weeks, maybe more, and then something shifted. Not a dramatic moment. Not a revelation in the traditional sense. More like a slow recalibration. Because Daniel had been operating all those years with a part of his energy directed toward the hope of eventual recognition from his father. The hope that the notebooks would one day impress someone. That the discipline and the patience and the quiet work would be seen for what it was. That hope had been present in him like background noise, constant but unacknowledged. The will killed that hope. And when it died, something else got quiet enough to hear. The question Daniel started asking, the one he wrote at the top of a new notebook page in November 2019, was not, how do I show them they were wrong? That's the question people expect in a story like this. The revenge story. The proof story. The question he wrote was simpler than that. It was, what would I build if I wasn't building it for anyone else? He sat with that question for 2 weeks. And the answer, when it came, was almost embarrassingly obvious. He had 17 acres off Cutter Lane. He had more savings, nearly $40,000 now, accumulated over years. He had Route 63, which had been approved in 2017 and was now under construction, projected to be completed in late 2021. He had 6 years of supply chain knowledge from Baseline AG. He had 12 years of notebooks. What he was going to build was a logistics and storage facility.
Small to start.
A commercial cold storage and distribution hub, positioned to serve the farming corridor that the new highway would open up. The idea wasn't complicated. The execution wasn't going to be either. But the timing was everything. The highway was coming. The area was going to change. And he was already there, holding 17 acres that nobody had thought was worth much, in exactly the right place. He didn't tell his brother. He didn't tell his sister. He didn't tell his mother. He called a contractor named Bill Yates on a Monday morning and asked him to come out to Cutter Lane. Construction started in February 2020, which, as timing goes, was either brave or reckless depending on who you asked. The world, as it turned out, was about to have other plans. But Daniel had structured things carefully enough that the disruption, when it came, didn't break him. It slowed him down. There's a difference. Bill Yates built the first structure on the Cutter Lane property in 10 weeks, a modest but functional cold storage building, 2,000 square feet, climate-controlled, with a concrete foundation that had been engineered for potential expansion. Total construction cost came in at $62,000. Daniel financed 40 of it through a small business loan he'd spent 4 months preparing the documentation for and paid the rest from savings. He quit his job at Baseline AG in March of that year, a decision that prompted the most direct expression of concern he'd heard from his family since the will reading. His mother called him twice. Marcus mentioned it on a Sunday when their paths crossed at the gas station. The consensus, spoken and unspoken, was that this was exactly the kind of risky, impractical thing that confirmed what everyone already suspected about Daniel's judgment. He listened, thanked people for their concern, and went back to work. The pandemic complicated the timeline in real ways. Supply deliveries were delayed. The contractor had 3 crew members sick in April and progress slowed to a crawl for 6 weeks. Daniel spent those weeks doing what he'd always done, reading, calculating, adjusting. He revised his projections. He made calls. He contacted 4 farming operations in the county about potential storage partnerships and had 2 conversations that felt genuinely promising. He also, during that period, started attending county commissioner meetings. Quietly, as an observer, learning how the language of local governance worked, understanding which decisions were made where and who made them. He introduced himself to people without explaining what he was building. He was interested, attentive, and unhurried. By August 2020, the storage building was complete. By October, he had his first paying client, a mid-size vegetable operation 20 miles east that needed off-site cold storage for overflow product during peak season.
It was a modest contract.
$900 a month. But it was real. He got a second client in January 2021. A third by April. Each contract was small. None of them were transformative on their own. But what Daniel was building was not a single transaction. He was building a network, slowly, patiently, the way someone builds anything that's meant to last. Every new client brought a referral possibility. Every conversation at a county meeting brought a connection he'd follow up on 6 months later when it became relevant. In the spring of 2021, he broke ground on the second building. Larger this time, for 1,000 square feet, with loading dock infrastructure designed to accommodate refrigerated trucks. He'd gotten a second loan, larger than the first, and this time the documentation was easier to prepare because he had 18 months of revenue to show. But here's what was quietly happening in parallel, and what nobody was paying attention to yet. Route 63's first phase was nearing completion, and a regional distribution company out of Lexington had been quietly looking for staging facilities in exactly this corridor. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in June 2021. Daniel was on the property, talking through a drainage adjustment with Bill Yates, when his phone rang. A woman named Karen Ashby, who identified herself as a real estate and facilities coordinator for a company called Tri-State Cold Chain Logistics, was calling to inquire about his storage facility. She'd found him through a county business registry. One of Daniel's clients had mentioned his name in passing. He set up a meeting for the following Monday. Tri-State Cold Chain was not a household name, but it was a serious operation, a regional distribution network that handled food logistics across 3 states, working primarily with mid-size agricultural producers who couldn't afford their own distribution infrastructure. They moved product. They needed places to stage it. And with Route 63 opening a new transportation corridor through eastern Kentucky, They were mapping potential facility partnerships in the region. Daniel's property was not the only option they were evaluating.
He knew that going in.
But it had something that most of the other options didn't. It was already built, already operating, already permitted, and it sat on 17 acres with documented expansion room. The Monday meeting lasted 2 hours. Karen Ashby brought 2 colleagues. They walked the property, reviewed his permits and specifications, asked detailed questions about his expansion plans. Daniel answered everything directly and without inflation. He didn't oversell. He showed them the second building under construction, the drainage maps, the road access plans. He showed them where a third building could go. They told him they'd be in touch. He waited 3 weeks. Then Karen Ashby called again. Tri-State Cold Chain was interested in a partnership arrangement, not just a client agreement, but a facility partnership that would give them dedicated staging capacity in the corridor and would give Daniel guaranteed monthly revenue, plus a percentage arrangement on volume above a base threshold. The base revenue, under the initial proposal, was $11,000 a month. Daniel read the proposal 4 times over 2 days. He made 3 small modifications and sent it back. They accepted 2 of the 3. He signed the agreement on September 14, 2021. The same week Route 63 opened. He drove home that evening and sat in the parking lot of his apartment for 20 minutes, the way he had 2 years before. But this time the feeling was different. By the end of 2022, the picture had changed substantially enough that people who knew Daniel Mercer were starting to pay attention, whether they wanted to or not. The Tri-State Partnership had expanded beyond the initial agreement. 3 months in, the volume of product moving through the Cutter Lane facility exceeded the base threshold consistently enough that the percentage arrangement kicked in every single month. By spring of 2022, Daniel's monthly revenue from the facility alone was running between $16,000 and $20,000, depending on the season. He had hired 3 full-time employees and 2 seasonal workers. He had broken ground on the 3rd building. He had also, in January 2022, quietly purchased an adjacent parcel, 12 acres. The owner, a farmer named Lester Goins who'd been trying to sell for 2 years, accepted an offer of $83,000, well below what the parcel would now command in 18 months, but a fair price for the moment, and a price Lester was grateful to receive. The Cutter Lane property was now 29 acres. The business was formally incorporated as Mercer Cold Chain Solutions, LLC. It had a logo, simple, dark blue, designed by a student at a local community college for $400. It had a website. It had, by mid-2022, an inquiry from a second regional logistics operator who had heard through the Tri-State Network that there was a well-run independent facility in the Route 63 corridor. Daniel was 35 years old. He was not, by any external measure, wealthy. He still drove the same truck, now with a new side mirror. He lived in a slightly better apartment on the east side of Harlan, a 2-bedroom he rented for $800 a month. He was reinvesting aggressively. Almost everything the business earned went back into expansion, infrastructure, and debt reduction, but the numbers were real. The growth was real, and the land, the 17 acres he'd acquired for $13,000 in 2016, was now conservatively assessed at $460,000, based on comparable commercial parcels in the newly activated corridor. With the additional 12 acres, the property value sat at roughly $700,000. And the same period, the Mercer family farm on Route 119 had gone through a difficult refinancing. Marcus had managed to hold on to it, but the terms were unfavorable and the underlying profitability hadn't improved. The farm was stable, but only barely, and only through a combination of Marcus's hard work and a small USDA assistance program that covered a portion of the operating costs. Nobody said anything. Not directly, but the comparison was becoming difficult to ignore. The moment it became impossible to ignore came at an unexpected occasion. A wedding. Patrice's daughter Emma got married in August 2022 at a venue outside Harlan, and for the first time in years the extended Mercer family, aunts, cousins, neighbors, the old community infrastructure, was assembled in one place. People knew things by then. Small towns move information the way water moves through ground, invisibly, constantly, always finding the lowest point. Word had traveled. Daniel Mercer had built something on Cutter Lane. He had a company. He had a tri-state contract. The details were approximate in the telling, the way small-town information always is, but the direction was accurate. Old Pete Callahan was at the wedding. The same Pete Callahan who had stood in the feed store 20 years ago and told Daniel's father that Daniel thought too much and worked too little. Pete found Daniel near the drink table during the reception, extended his hand, and said, "I hear you've been busy out on Cutter Lane." Daniel shook his hand and said, "Yes, sir. Got a few buildings up." "That's good land now," Pete said. "Good position." "Yes, sir." There was a pause. The kind of pause that carries the weight of everything that isn't being said. "Your father would have been interested," Pete said finally. IT was the closest thing to an acknowledgement Daniel was going to receive from that direction, and he understood it for what it was. He nodded, thanked Pete, and moved on. Marcus pulled him aside later in the evening, near the parking lot where the lights were low. They hadn't spoken privately in a long time. Marcus was looking older. The farm work had that effect, and the financial stress had compounded it. He congratulated Daniel on what he was building. It was genuine. Marcus was not a complicated man, and he had no cruelty in him, only the limited vision that comes from never needing to look beyond a path that was always prepared for you. "I didn't know you had all that going," Marcus said. "I didn't talk about it much," Daniel said. Marcus nodded. "I should have been paying more attention." It wasn't an apology for the will. It wasn't a reckoning. But it was something. Patrice was more formal. She found him at the dessert table, congratulated him in the way competent people congratulate other competent people when it costs them something small to do so, and asked a few pointed questions about the business. Questions that were intelligent and genuine. Patrice had always been smart. Daniel answered them honestly. And at the end, she said, "Dad underestimated you." Just that. And then she walked away. 3 years after that wedding, the picture had expanded beyond what even Daniel had originally projected. Mercer Cold Chain Solutions, by the end of 2024, was operating 4 buildings on the Cutter Lane property, with a total storage and processing capacity of just under 12,000 square feet. The property itself had grown to 37 acres following the purchase of a third adjacent parcel. The company employed 11 full-time staff and a variable seasonal workforce of between 6 and 14 people, depending on the agricultural cycle. The second logistics partnership, the inquiry that had come through the Tri-State Network in 2022, had become a formal agreement with a company called Mountain Ridge Distribution, which served a different regional food chain than Tri-State and brought a complementary client base. Together, the two partnerships anchored the revenue base of the business. Above that anchor, Daniel had cultivated 23 independent client relationships with farming operations throughout a 60-mile radius. Annual revenue in 2024 was projected at just over $1.4 million. The property, all 37 acres, had been independently appraised at $1.2 million. Daniel had paid off the original land acquisition loan in 2022. He'd refinanced the construction debt at favorable terms in 2023 on the strength of 3 years of documented business performance. The balance sheet was, for the first time, genuinely healthy, but what mattered more than the numbers, at least in the way the story needs to be understood, was what the business represented in the fabric of the community. Mercer Cold Chain Solutions had become something real. A place that provided jobs to people who grew up in Harlan County and hadn't had many options. A facility that let small and mid-sized farming operations access a part of the supply chain they couldn't afford independently. A business that was, in the most practical sense, making it slightly easier for the agricultural economy of southeastern Kentucky to function. Daniel hired a young woman named Rochelle Watkins in early 2023 to manage client relations. She was 24, grew up in Harlan, had a logistics certificate from the community college. She was good at her job, and Daniel gave her room to grow into it. By 2024, she was managing most of the client-facing operations independently, while Daniel focused on expansion planning. He also hired a 22-year-old named Kevin Aldred as a facility operations coordinator. Kevin had grown up on a farm. He was the kind of person who noticed things, asked questions, and kept notes. Daniel recognized something in that. In the spring of 2025, Daniel's mother, Margaret Mercer, came to visit the Cutter Lane property for the first time. She was 71 years old, still sharp, still the kind of woman who noticed everything and said exactly as much as she chose to. She'd been living alone since Robert died in 2020 in the house on Route 119, with Marcus checking on her regularly and Patrice calling from Lexington every Sunday. Daniel drove her out to the property on a Saturday morning. He showed her the buildings, the loading docks, the layout. He introduced her to Rochelle and to Kevin. He walked her through the expansion drawings for the fifth building, which was scheduled to break ground in July. His mother was quiet for most of the walk. At the end, standing at the edge of the property where the land opened toward the south, she said, "You always had the notebooks." "I did," he said. "Your father never understood that." "He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to."
He was a proud man, she said.
And proud men make mistakes when they confuse pride for wisdom. They drove back to her house and had lunch. She asked questions about the business that showed she'd been paying closer attention than anyone had known. Questions about the tri-state contract structure, about the staffing model, about what happened to the independent clients when the big partners adjusted their volume allocations. Good questions. Questions that revealed the mind that had, all along, been running quiet behind the domestic surface of a life that looked simpler than it was. Before she left, she gave him something he hadn't known existed. A letter, in Robert Mercer's handwriting, dated November 2019, 1 month after the will reading. It wasn't addressed to anyone.
It was more like a note to himself.
In it, Robert wrote that he knew Daniel was going to be all right, that he'd always known it, that the exclusion from the will was a decision rooted in something he hadn't been able to explain properly about the farm and what it owed Marcus, and that he'd meant to talk to Daniel directly, but hadn't found the moment, and then the moments ran out. It wasn't the conversation Daniel would have chosen. It wasn't the apology or the explanation or the recognition in time. But it was something. It was a window into a man who had more going on behind the silence than anyone had been given credit for. Daniel put the letter in the glove compartment, next to the notebook. He gave Kevin Aldred, the 22-year-old with the farmer's instincts and the habit of keeping notes, the same advice he'd given no one until now. Keep writing things down. The questions matter more than the answers. The answers come later if you're patient enough. Kevin nodded like he already understood. Maybe he did. People talk about revenge like it's a destination. Like there's a moment when you arrive, when the people who doubted you are finally watching, finally seeing, and the account is settled. But Daniel Mercer never really chased that moment. He chased something quieter and more durable. He chased the question he'd written in capital letters on a blank notebook page in November 2019. What would I build if I wasn't building it for anyone else? The answer, it turned out, was everything. Because when you stop building for an audience and start building from the inside out, from genuine curiosity, from patient observation, from a faith in your own understanding that doesn't require external validation to survive, what you build has a different quality than anything constructed from the need to prove something. That it doesn't just stand up. It keeps standing. The real inheritance Daniel Mercer received from his family had nothing to do with the will. It was the 41 acres on Route 119 where a quiet boy walked the fields and noticed things. The father who dismissed his questions and inadvertently taught him to trust his own answers. The community that looked past him and freed him from the tyranny of expectation. Exclusion, as it turned out, was the most expensive gift his family ever gave him, because it left him with no story to maintain, no inheritance to protect, no approval to court, just a cracked side mirror truck, $18,000 and 17 acres that nobody else thought was worth anything, and a question. What would you build if you weren't building it for anyone else? Think carefully before you answer. The answer might surprise you.